Although carefully educated in medicine and surgery, I've never practiced either. The study of each discipline, however, continues to interest me profoundly, and it was neither idleness nor caprice which caused my secession from the honourable calling. The cause was a very trifling scratch inflicted by a dissecting knife, and this trifle cost me the loss of two fingers on my left hand, swiftly amputated, and the more painful loss of my health, because I've never been quite well since, and have seldom spent 12 months together in the same place. In my wanderings, I have, of course, become acquainted with many interesting people of many different backgrounds. But the most remarkable man that I ever met, and upon my own life the most influential, was Dr. Martin Hesselius. Now, Dr. Hesselius was a wanderer like myself, like me a physician, and like me an enthusiast in his profession. Unlike me, he was a man, well, if not of fortune, as we estimate it in England, then one who at least lived in what our forefathers used to term easy circumstances. And unlike me, his wanderings were voluntary. Now, he impressed me deeply from the very beginning, did Dr. Hesselius. I mean, he was already old when I first met him. He was nearly 35 years my senior. And I found in him my master. He was just the sort of man to inspire a young enthusiast like me, and my admiration for him has survived the separation of death. For nearly 20 years, I acted as Dr. Hesselius's medical secretary, and after he died, his immense collection of papers were left in my care to be arranged and indexed and bound. Now, I have, of course, read these papers with the utmost care and admiration, and although it can't be denied that Dr. Hesselius's treatment of certain cases was sometimes curious, I remain convinced that my admiration for him was well founded. Here and there, a case has struck me as likely to amuse or perhaps horrify the non-specialist, and it is with only some slight modifications, chiefly of language and of course a change of names, that I present one of these cases to you now. I found it among the voluminous notes which the doctor made during a tour in England in the early part of the 19th century, and it is related for the most part in a series of letters to his friend Professor Van Loo of Leiden. Now, Professor Van Loo was not a physician himself. He was, I think, in fact, a chemist. So the narrative is written in a manner readily comprehensible to the intelligent layman. The letters appear to have been returned to Dr. Hesselius on Van Loo's death in 1819. They're written for the greater part in German, of course, of which I am, I hope, a faithful, if not graceful, translator. And although here and there I have omitted some passages and abbreviated some others, I've interpolated nothing. So, the letters of Dr. Martin Hesselius to Professor Van Loo of Leiden. The Reverend Jennings is a tall, thin, middle-aged man, and he dresses with a natty high church precision. His features, without being handsome, are well formed, and their expression is extremely kind and rather shy. I met him one evening at Lady Mary Haddock's. We were a small party, and Mr. Jennings joined agreeably enough in with the conversation. He enjoys listening, I think, more than contributing to talk, but what he says is always to the purpose. He's a charitable man too, I'm told, and one most diligent in his sacred profession. And yet, although always tolerably well elsewhere, when he goes down to his vicarage at Kenlis in Warwickshire to engage in the duties of his calling, his health regularly fails him, and in a very strange way. I mean, it may be his heart or it may be his brain, says Lady Mary, but it has happened 3 or 4 times that after proceeding a certain way in the service, Mr. Jennings has suddenly stopped short, and after a silence has fallen into a solitary, inaudible prayer, his hands and his eyes uplifted. Then, pale as death, and in the agitation of some strange horror, he's descended from the pulpit and gone trembling into the vestry, leaving his congregation, without explanation, to themselves. Now, this first occurred when his curate was absent, and when he goes down to Kenlis now, Mr. Jennings is always careful to provide a clergyman to share his duty should he become thus incapacitated. Now, when Mr. Jennings breaks down like this, he always returns immediately to London, and Lady Mary says that then he's always perfectly well. I have my own opinion of that, though there are degrees, of course, but we shall see. He is, as I've suggested, a gentlemanly fellow and invariably polite, but he leaves a slightly odd impression. And every now and then in conversation, he has a way of looking sidelong along the carpet, as if his eye were following some movement there. Now, this is not a constant habit, but it happens often enough to give a certain oddity to his manner. And in this travelling glance along the floor, there's something both shy and anxious. I observed, of course, more than I set down here, but I reserve all that borders on the technical for a strictly scientific paper. And of course, when I speak of science, I do so in a more comprehensive sense than the word is generally understood today. I mean, as you well know, Professor, I believe that the natural world is but the ultimate expression of that spiritual world from which and in which it alone it has its life. But forgive me, this is not the proper place for displaying the proofs and discussing the consequences of this too generally unrecognized fact. Now, in pursuance of my habit, I was covertly observing Mr. Jennings that evening, and I saw plainly that he was, just as cautiously and stealthily, observing me. At one point in the evening, Lady Mary happened to address me by my title as Dr. Hesselius, at which Jennings glanced at me sharply and became thoughtful for a few minutes. By and by, he approached me, and in a little time, we had got into conversation. He spoke German very well, and I could tell early on that this gentle, scholarly man was weighing in his mind the idea of taking a certain step with regard to me. We chatted upon indifferent subjects for a time, until at last he said, "I was very much interested by your book on metaphysical medicine, Dr. Hesselius." "Oh, yes, I read it in German some 10 or 12 years ago. I'd very much like to revisit it, but the publishers tell me that it is out of print." "Ah, alas, yes, for some years now, I'm afraid," I said. "But I'm flattered that you remember my little book, although 10 years is a long time to have managed without it. Perhaps something has happened to revive your interest in it." Mr. Jennings seemed to blush, but I pretended not to notice. "If you still care to possess a copy, I have 2 or 3 spare. If you'd allow me to present you one, I should be very much honoured." "Oh, really? Oh, Dr. Hesselius, well, that is very, very kind. Gosh, yeah, I'd almost despaired. Well, I really don't know how to thank you. Please, don't say another word. If you thank me any more, I shall throw the book into the fire in a fit of modesty." Mr. Jennings laughed and inquired where I was staying in London. I told him, and after a little more conversation, he took his leave. "I like your vicar very much, Lady Mary," I said when he'd gone. "He has read and travelled and suffered. He must be a valued friend." Oh, he is, Dr. Hesselius. He truly is. And what's more, he's a genuinely good man. Yes, I can well believe it. I can only testify to his being an agreeable conversationalist. But in addition to what you've told me, I think I can tell you 1 or 2 things about him." "Go on, Dr. Hesselius." "Well, to begin with, he's unmarried." "Quite right. And he's been writing, no?" That is, he was writing, but for 2 or 3 years, he's not got on with his work. And the book he was working on was to be upon some rather abstract subject, perhaps theology." Well, I mean, he was writing a book. I'm not quite sure what it was about, but I understand that he has given it up, yes. And although he only drank a little coffee here tonight, he likes tea. At least, he did like it, extravagantly. Yes, green tea, I think. A great deal of green tea. Well, that is very odd. Yes, green tea was a subject on which we used almost to quarrel. But he has quite given that up too. He has. And one more fact, Lady Mary. His mother, or his father perhaps. Did you know them, by the way? Yes, I knew both of them. His father He's only 10 years dead. We knew them very well. Yes, well, either his mother or his father, I rather think it is his father, once saw a ghost. You really are a conjurer, Dr. Hesselius. Have I spoken true? You have. And it was his father. Oh, he was a strange man, I always thought. He used to come and bore my father about his dreams. And one day he told him a story about a ghost that he'd seen and talked with. And a very odd story it was, too. I remember it particularly because I was so afraid of him. I mean, I was only a child at the time, you see, and his ways were so silent and moping. He used to drop in sometimes in the dusk when I was alone in the drawing room, and I used to fancy there were ghosts about him. I smiled and nodded. And now, having established my character as a conjurer, Lady Mary, I think I must say good night. But how did you know all that, Dr. Hesselius? By the planets, Lady Mary. How else? By the planets, as all good gypsies do. Good night. Well, the next morning, I sent Mr. Jennings the little book that he'd been inquiring after, and on returning late that evening, I found that he'd called at my lodgings and left his card. I returned the visit as soon as I politely could the following day. On inquiring at the door of his house in Piccadilly, I was told that Mr. Jennings was engaged. So I said that I would try another time, and I turned to go when the servant begged my pardon and asked whether I was Dr. Hesselius. Well, perhaps then, sir, he said, you would allow me to mention it to Mr. Jennings, because I think he wishes to see you. Well, the servant returned in a moment and asked me to go into his master's study, promising that he would be with me in a very few minutes. It was a lofty room, much larger than I'd expected, with tall, slender windows and rich, dark curtains. It was lined with books every side, from floor to ceiling. The effect, although extremely comfortable, was decidedly gloomy. It was almost oppressively silent in there, and I stepped in with a peculiar sense of foreboding. As I waited for Mr. Jennings, I browsed his library, and on the floor I lighted upon a complete set of Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia. It was a very fine set, bound in vellum with gold letters and carmine edges. There were paper markers in several of these volumes, and I allowed the pages to fall open where some of them were placed. And a number of passages I saw had been marked out by pencil lines in the margin. This is a selection of them. When a man's interior sight is opened, which is that of his spirit, then there appear the things of another life which cannot possibly be made visible to the bodily sight. And again, if evil spirits could perceive that they were associated with man, and yet that they were spirits separate from him, and if they could flow into the things of his body, they would attempt by 1,000 means to destroy him, for they hate man with a deadly hatred. And yet again, knowing therefore that I was a man in the body, they were continually striving to destroy me, not as to the body only, but especially as to the soul. For to destroy any man or spirit is the very delight of all who are in hell. But I've been continually protected by the Lord, hence it appears how dangerous it is for a man to be living in consort with spirits unless he be in good faith. Now, a long note written in Mr. Jennings' neat hand at the foot of this particular page caught my eye. Expecting his criticism upon the text, I read a word or two, and then I stopped, because it was something quite different. And the note began with these words: Deus misereatur me. May God compassionate me. Well, thus warned of its private nature, I averted my eyes and shut the book, replacing all the volumes except one which had particularly interested me. I'd arrived at a passage, the substance of which was that evil spirits, when seen by other eyes than those of their infernal associates, present themselves by correspondence in the shape of the beast which best represents their particular lust and life. I was running my finger along the line as I read it, and something caused me to raise my eyes. Directly before me was a mirror, and in this I saw reflected the tall shape of Mr. Jennings. He was leaning over my shoulder, reading the same page as I, and with a face so dark and wild that I should hardly have known him. I turned and rose rather suddenly. He stood erect also, and with an effort laughed. I came in and asked how you did, and well, I'm sorry if I alarmed you. You didn't alarm me. This is not your first time of looking into these pages, is it, Dr. Hesselius? You have read Swedenborg before. Oh yes, indeed, yes. I owe Swedenborg a great deal. Yes, I'm sure you do. I'm scarcely qualified myself. I know so little of him. I've only had that set a fortnight, but I do think that his writings are likely to make a solitary man rather nervous. That is judging from the little that I have read. I don't say that they have made me so, of course. I'm very much obliged for your book, Dr. Hesselius. I hope that you got my note. I did, thank you, yes. I never read another book, I think, that I go with so entirely. I saw at once that there is more in it than is quite unfolded. Tell me, do you know Dr. Harley? Yes, well, we have corresponded. Yes, I think he's one of the very greatest fools that I ever met in my life. This was the first time that I'd heard Mr. Jennings say a sharp thing of anybody, and such a term applied to so high a name, I admit, startled me. In what way? I asked. In his profession? Yes, he seems to me half blind. I mean, one half of all he looks at is dark, the rest is preternaturally bright and vivid, and the worst of it is that it seems willful. You know, I can't get him. Oh, you see, I have had some experience of him as a physician, you see, Dr. Hesselius, and I'm afraid I have come to look on him as no better than a mental paralytic, an intellect half dead. You stay some months longer in England, Doctor. Yes, I'm glad to hear that. And I wonder if I should be out of town during your stay for a little time, would you allow me to trouble you with a letter? I should only be too happy, Mr. Jennings. It's very good of you. I'm so utterly dissatisfied with Harley, you see. Yes, a little leaning to the materialistic school, perhaps, I said. Yes, that's it. A mere materialist. That is it precisely, Doctor. You can't think how that sort of thing worries one who knows better. But, well, look, please, you won't tell anyone else that I'm hippish with you. And yet no one knows, you see, that I have been seeking any medical help, not even Lady Mary. You won't mention it, will you? And if I should have an attack, you will let me write to you. Or should I be in town, perhaps I could even have a little talk with you. It would mean so very much. But unconsciously, I found that I had fixed my eyes rather gravely upon him, because he lowered his for a moment and sighed. Ah, yes, I see that you're forming a conjecture. It's perfectly understandable, but you may as well give it up, Dr. Hesselius. If you were guessing for the rest of your life, you would never hit upon it. He shook his head, smiling, and then over that brief wintry sunshine, a black cloud descended, and he drew his breath in through his teeth, as men do when they're in pain. And I spoke as reassuringly to him as I could. I'm sorry, of course, to learn that you have occasion to consult any of us, but command me when and how you like, and I need not assure you that your confidence is sacred. He then thanked me, and we talked of quite other things in a comparatively light-hearted way. And after a little time, I took my leave. We parted cheerfully, but he was not cheerful, and nor was I. You know, there are certain expressions of the human face which, although I have seen them often and possess a doctor's nerve, yet disturb me. And one look of Mr. Jennings disturbed me profoundly. It had seized my imagination with so dismal a power, in fact, that I changed my plans for that evening. I went to the opera, feeling that I needed a complete change of ideas. I heard nothing of him for 3 days, and then a note in his hand reached me, and it was cheerful. full of hope. He said that he felt much better, that he was going to make a little experiment and run down to his parish to try whether a little work might not quite set him up. There was in it a fervent religious expression of gratitude for his restoration, as he now almost hoped he might call it. 2 days later, however, I received another note. "Dear sir," it said, "I have returned disappointed. If I should feel at all able to see you, I shall write and ask you to call. At present, however, I am too low. Pray don't mention this to my friends. I can see no one. By and by, please God, you shall hear from me. I mean to take a run into Shropshire, where some of my people are. God bless you, Dr. Hesselius. May we on my return meet more happily than I can write now." And about a week later, I saw Lady Mary, and she told me that she'd heard from Mr. Jennings's niece, Martha, in Shropshire. There was nothing to be gathered from her letter more than that he was low and nervous. And, well, in those words, of which healthy people think so lightly, what a world of suffering they are sometimes hidden. Nearly 5 weeks now passed without any further news of Mr. Jennings, at the end of which time I received another note. "I have been in the country," he wrote, "and have had a change of air, change of scene, change of faces, change of everything and in everything but myself. I've made up my mind, so far as the most irresolute creature on earth can do it, to tell my case fully to you. If your engagement will permit, pray come to me today, tomorrow, next day, but please defer as little as possible. You know not how much I need help. I have a house at Richmond where I am now. My servant will have a carriage at your door at any hour you please, and I'm always to be found in. You will say that I ought not to be alone. I've tried everything. Come and see." Well, I went to Richmond that same evening. Now, the vicar would have been much better in a lodging house or a hotel, I thought, as I drove up through a short double row of sombre elms to an old-fashioned brick house, darkened by the foliage of these trees which nearly surrounded it. I mean, it was a perverse choice for a sick man, because nothing could be imagined more triste and silent. The sun had set already, and the red reflected light of the western sky illuminated the scene. The hallway seemed very dark when I was let in, but getting to the back drawing room, whose windows commanded the west, I was again in the same dusky light. I sat down, looking out upon the richly wooded landscape that glowed in the grand and melancholy light, which was every moment fading. The encroaching gloom was insensibly toning my own mind, when the door opened and the tall figure of Mr. Jennings came, with quiet, stealthy steps into the room. We shook hands, and taking a chair to the window where there was still enough light to see each other's faces, he sat down beside me, and placing his hand upon my arm, with scarcely a word of preface, he began his narrative. Now, from that fixed face of suffering that stood out like a portrait of Shulkin's before its background of darkness, I guessed well the nature, though not even vaguely the particulars, of the revelations that I was about to receive. "It began," he said, "on the 15th of October, 3 years and 11 weeks ago, and 2 days. I keep a very accurate count, Doctor, for every day is torment. If I leave any gap in my narrative, please be sure to let me know. About 4 years ago, I began a work which involved a great deal of thought and reading. It was upon the religious metaphysics of the ancients." "How interesting," I said. "Yes, but not good. Not good for the mind, the Christian mind, I mean, God help me. I wrote a great deal. I wrote late at night, much of it here in this room. But you see, wherever I was, my mind was always dwelling on the subject. It thoroughly infected me. Now, I believe that everyone who sets about writing in earnest does his work, as a friend of mine phrased it, on something. With coffee perhaps, or tobacco. I dare say there are many other things. Tea was my companion. Yeah, it was ordinary black tea at first, made in the usual way, not too strong. I never experienced any uncomfortable symptom from it. But I drank a good deal and increased the strength as I went on. And then I began to take a little green tea, just a little. I found the effect pleasanter. It intensified. I felt the power of thought. And so I came to take it frequently, but not stronger than one might take it for pleasure. I used to sit up very late, and it became a habit of mine to sip my green tea every now and then as my work proceeded. I had a little kettle on my table here that swung over that lamp, and I'd make tea 2 or 3 times a night between 11 o'clock and 2 or 3 in the morning when I usually went to bed. Now, I was not a monk, Dr. Hesselius, during this period, but by no means. No, I used to go into town almost every day, although I'd often spend an hour or two in the library hunting up authorities or checking references. I was in no morbid state, as far as I can judge. I met my friends pretty much as usual, and I enjoyed their society. And on the whole, I must say, existence had never been so pleasant before. I'd met with a man who had some odd old books. They were German editions of medieval Latin, and he was kind enough to allow me to have access to them. He kept them in the city. It was a very out-of-the-way part. Well, one night I'd rather outstayed my intended hour, and on coming out of his premises and seeing no cab nearby, I was tempted to get into the omnibus which used to drive past this house. It was twilight by the time the bus reached a house. You might have noticed it on your journey here yourself. It's an old place with 4 poplars at each side of the door. And it was here that the last passenger, but myself, got out. Now, we drove along a little faster after that, and I leaned back in my corner next to the door, ruminating pleasantly. The interior of the omnibus was nearly dark by now. And I observed in the corner opposite me 2 small circular reflections of what looked like a reddish light. They were perhaps 2 inches apart, about the size of those small brass buttons that yachting men used to put upon their jackets. Well, I mean, as listless men will, I began to speculate upon this trifle. From what centre did that faint but deep red light come, and from what was it reflected? I'd made little headway with the puzzle when it suddenly became even more odd, because these 2 luminous points, with a sharp jerk, suddenly descended nearer and nearer to the floor, keeping still their relative distance and horizontal position. And then, as suddenly, they rose to the level of the seat on which I was sitting, and I saw them no more. Well, my curiosity was by now thoroughly excited, and before I had time to think, I saw those 2 dull lamps again, together near the floor. And again they disappeared. And again, in the old corner, I saw them. Well, keeping my eyes fixed upon them now, I edged that way and leaned forward to discover what these little circles really were. And as I did so, they shifted their position a little. And I began now to perceive an outline of something around them. It was something black. And I soon saw with tolerable distinctness the outline of a small black monkey. It was pushing its little face forward in mimicry to meet mine, and the red discs that I'd seen were its eyes, and I could also now see its teeth grinning at me. I drew back in some surprise. I mean, my first thought was that one of the passengers had left his ugly little pet by accident, and wishing to ascertain something of its temper, I poked my umbrella softly towards it. And it remained immovable up to it and through it. Yes, Doctor, through it. Back and forward my umbrella passed without the slightest resistance. Now, as I stared, incredulous, the monkey made a little skip back into the corner, and I, in a sudden panic, found myself at the door, drawing deep breaths of the outer air, staring at the passing lights and trees, glad to reassure myself of some kind of reality. And then I stopped the bus and I got out. And the man looked at me oddly as I paid him, and I dare say there was something unusual in my looks and manner, but I had never felt so strange before. When the omnibus drove on and I was alone upon the road, I looked carefully round to ascertain whether the monkey had followed me. And to my indescribable relief, I couldn't see it. I cannot describe easily the shock that I'd received, or my sense of gratitude on finding myself rid of it. But, well, I'd got out a little before we reached this house, you see. You might remember that there's a brick wall running along the footpath, about as high as my shoulder. Yeah, well, happening to raise my eyes, I saw the monkey up there, creeping on all fours, close beside me, along the top of the wall. Well, I stopped. It stopped. It sat up on the wall, hands on its knees, looking down at me. I mean, there was not enough light to see much more than its outline, nor was it dark enough to bring the peculiar light of its eyes into strong relief, but I saw that red, foggy light plainly enough. I mean, it didn't show its teeth now, nor exhibit any sign of irritation. In fact, it seemed rather jaded and sulky, and it was observing me steadily. I mean, I drew back into the middle of the road, and I stood for a moment just looking at this monkey. And then, with an instinctive determination to try something, anything, I turned about and walked briskly back towards town, and the beast set off too, creeping along the wall at exactly my pace. And then, where the wall ends, it sprang down close to my feet and continued to keep up with me, even as I quickened my own pace. It was at my left side, so close to my leg, in fact, that I felt at every moment that I was about to step on it. I stopped, bewildered, and as soon as I came to a halt, the monkey drew back 5 yards and remained stationary, staring at me. I'm sorry, I was perhaps more agitated than I've managed to indicate now. The road was quite deserted and silent, and it was getting darker every moment. I mean, I'd read, of course, we've all read about spectral illusions, as you physicians term them, and I considered my situation. I tried to comfort myself by repeating the assurance, that this thing is purely a disease, a well-known physical affection. Don't be a fool now. You've been sitting up too late, and I dare say your digestion is quite wrong. With God's help, all shall be well again. That this is but a symptom of nervous dyspepsia. But did I believe this? Not a word, Doctor. No more than any other miserable being ever did, who is once seized and riveted in this satanic captivity. I was simply bullying myself into a false courage. Well, I made up my mind to pass the night at home, and turning abruptly, I walked in that direction. I had only a few hundred yards to go. Now, the brute moved closer beside me now, and I fancied that there was that sort of anxious drawing towards the house, which one sometimes sees in horses or dogs as they approach home. At the hall door, it waited till I mounted the steps, and when the door was opened, it pattered in with me. Well, I drank no tea that night. Instead, I got brandy and water and cigars. My idea was that I should act upon my material system, and by living for a while in sensation, apart from thought, I send myself forcibly, as it were, into a new groove. I came up here. I sat in that chair, and the monkey got up onto that small table. It seemed languid, its eyes were half closed, but I could still see the red glow behind them. And it was constantly looking at me, you see. In all situations, Dr. Hesselius, at all hours, it is always awake. And it's always looking at me. That never changes, nor does its malignity. It's unfathomable malignity. Yes, perhaps during the first year it did. It looked sullen and sick, but this intense malice, this vigilance was always there beneath the surly languor. Its eyes were never off me, and I've never lost sight of it, except in my sleep. I mean, light or day, dark or night, since it came here, excepting when it withdraws sometimes for weeks at a time. It's only a small monkey, black. And you see, in the darkness, it's as visible as in daylight. And, I don't just mean it's red-eyed. I mean, it's all visible distinctly in darkness, like it's in a kind of halo, like a glow of red embers. And when it does leave, you see, it's always at night in the dark. And in the same way, it suddenly grows very restless and then furious, and then it advances towards me, grinning and shaking, its paws clenched, and at the same time there comes the appearance of fire in the grate. Now, I never have any fire, Dr. Hesselius. I can't sleep in a room where there's a fire lit. And the monkey draws nearer and nearer to the chimney, quivering, it seems, with rage. And when its fury rises to the highest pitch, and I think that it's about to strike me, it springs into the grate and up the chimney, and I see it no more. I mean, when this first happened, I thought that I was released. A day passed and no return, a night. Then a blessed week and another. I was on my knees, thanking God and praying. A whole month passed. And then suddenly, it was with me again. It was back. And it was perfectly unchanged in every respect but one. The malice, which before had been torpid, was now active. Now, for a time, this change was shown only in an increased vivacity and an air of menace, as if it were always brooding over some atrocious plan. Its eyes, as before, were never off me. Is it here now, Reverend Jennings? I asked. No. No, it has been absent exactly a fortnight and a day, 15 days. It has sometimes been away as long as 2 months, once for 3. Its absence always exceeds a fortnight, although it may not be more than by a single day. 15 days have passed since I saw it last. It may return at any moment. And is its return, I asked her, accompanied by any peculiar manifestation? No. No, it's simply with me again, on lifting my eyes from a book or turning my head, I just see it looking at me, and then it waits as before for its appointed time. I've never told anyone this much before. My dear Dr. Hesselius, he suddenly grew agitated and started applying his handkerchief to his forehead, and I suggested that he needed a rest. I told him that I would call again the following morning. No, he said, please, I'm sorry, but if you don't mind yourself hearing it all now, I've got so far, please. Thank you. Well, you see, when I spoke to Dr. Harley, I had nothing like so much to tell him. I mean, but you are a philosophic physician, Dr. Hesselius. You give spirit its proper rank. If this thing is real, if it is real, it is prevailing, little by little, and drawing me more interiorly into hell. Its power of action, I tell you, had increased when it came back to me that first time. Its malice became, in a way, aggressive. About 2 years ago, I went down to my parish in Warwickshire, anxious to find occupation in my profession. I was not prepared for what had happened, although I have since thought that I should have been. It was with me during the whole journey down there. It was my silent travelling companion, and it remained with me at the vicarage, staring at me as usual and keeping its distance. But you see, when I entered into the discharge of my duties, a change took place. It began to exhibit an atrocious determination to thwart me. It was with me in the church, it was in the pulpit, it was at the communion rails, and at last it reached this extremity, that while I was reading to the congregation, it would spring up upon the book and squat there, so that I was unable to see the page. This happened several times, and that was when I placed myself in Dr. Harley's hands, and I did everything that he told me to. He gave my case a great deal of thought. To be fair to him, it interested him, I think, and well, he did. He seemed successful at first. For nearly 3 months, I was perfectly free. I began to think that I was safe. I returned to my parish in genuinely good spirits. I was happy and grateful. I was returning, as I thought, delivered from a dreadful hallucination to the scene of duties which I longed to enter upon. It was a beautiful sunny evening. Everything looked so serene and cheerful. And I was delighted, I remember, as I looked out of my carriage, to see the spire of my church among the trees at the point where one has the earliest view of it. It's exactly where a little stream that bounds the parish passes under the road by a culvert, and where it emerges at the roadside, a stone with an old inscription is placed. And as we passed that point, I drew my head in and sat down. And in the corner of the chaise was a monkey. Well, for a moment, I felt faint. And then I went wild with despair and horror. I shouted to the driver and got out, and I just sat at the roadside and prayed to God for mercy. And then I suppose a despairing resignation supervened. My companion was with me when I re-entered the vicarage. The same persecution that I described followed, and after a short struggle, I submitted once more and I returned to London. I told you, didn't I, that the beast had become aggressive? Yeah, well, let me explain. It seemed to be incited to the intensest fury whenever I said my prayers, or even meditated prayer. It used to spring up onto the table or onto the back of the chair or up onto the chimney piece and slowly swing itself from side to side and look at me in the most spiteful way. I mean, there is, you see, in its motion, this indefinable power to dissipate thought, to contract one's attention to that monotony till the ideas shrink, as it were, to a point and at last to nothing. And unless I'd started off and shaken off this catalepsy, I felt as if my mind were to a point of losing itself. And you see, even when I pray with my eyes closed, it comes to me, it comes closer and closer. I can still see it. I know that it isn't to be accounted for physically, but I do. I actually see it, even though my lids are closed, and so it rocks my mind, as it were, and I'm forced to rise to my knees and, well, and nothing. Now, if you'd ever yourself known this, Dr. Hesselius, you would be acquainted with the utmost desperation. They talk of the optic nerves, of spectral illusions, as if the organ of sight was the only point assailable by the influences that have fastened upon me. But I know better. For 2 years, that limitation prevailed. But as food is taken in softly at the lips and then brought under the teeth, as the tip of the little finger caught in a milk crank will draw in the hand and then the arm and then the whole body, well, so the miserable mortal who's once been caught firmly by the end of the finest fibre of his nerve is drawn in and in by the enormous machinery of hell until he is as I am now. Yes, Doctor, as I am now, because while I talk to you and implore relief, I feel that my prayer is for the impossible, and my pleading is with the inexorable. Mr. Jennings, I touched his arm to try to calm him down. Perhaps we should light some candles. I mean, the night had overtaken us as he talked, and the filmy moonlight was wide over the scene which the window commanded. This light, it's odd, I said, and I should wish you as much as possible under your usual conditions while I make my diagnosis. Oh, all light is the same to me, Dr. Hesselius, except when I read or write. I care not if night were perpetual. Now, I'm going to tell you next what happened about a year ago. Go on. The thing began to speak to me. How do you mean? I mean, it I said words and sentences with perfect coherence and articulation, not as a man speaks, though you say, oh, no. No, it's not like the tone of a human voice. It's not through the ears that it reaches me. It comes like a sort of singing through my head. And now when I try to pray, it interrupts me always with this dreadful blasphemies. God, doctor, can skill and thought and prayers of man avail me nothing? Please, Mr. Jennings, you must not trouble yourself with these thoughts. Please confine yourself strictly to the facts, and recollect above all that even if the thing that infests you is a reality, it can have no power to hurt you unless it be given from above. Now, its access to your senses depends upon your physical condition. That is, under God, your comfort and reliance. We are all alike environed. It is only that in your case, the veil of the flesh, the screen, is a little out of repair. We must simply enter on a new course. Be encouraged. I will give tonight to the careful consideration of the whole case. You're very good, Dr. Salius. You don't give up on me, and I thank you for that. But it is gaining such an influence over me. It orders me about now, and it's such a tyrant, and I'm growing so helpless. May God deliver me. It orders you about. Yes, it's always urging me to crimes, to injure others or to injure myself. When I was in Shropshire a few weeks ago, I went out one day with a party of friends for a walk. The country near the Dee, it's very, very beautiful. But our path usually happened to lie near a coal mine, and at the verge of the wood is a perpendicular shaft. They say it's 150 feet deep. Now, I was lagging behind the rest, and my niece had remained behind with me. She knows nothing, of course, of the nature of my sufferings, but she did know that I had been ill and was feeling rather low, and she remained to prevent me being quite on my own. As we loitered slowly on together, the monkey was urging me to... No, I'm not going to say. I'm not going to say what it. I will not do such things. I told my niece to go on ahead and walk with a friend, saying that I could go no further myself. But she said that she would stay, and the more I urged her, the firmer she became. She looked frightened, but she would not go, and that saved me, Doctor. That blessed, stubborn child prevented me from hurling myself into that abyss. You have no idea, sir, that a living man could be made so abject a slave of Satan. You were preserved nonetheless, I said. It was an act of God. Be confident, therefore, for the future. I made him have the candles lighted, and I saw the room looking cheery and inhabited before I left him. I told him that he must regard his illness strictly as one dependent on physical, although subtle, causes. I told him that he had evidence of God's care and love in the deliverance which he had just described, and as I reasoned this point with him, he wept, but he seemed comforted. One promise that I extracted from him, that should the monkey at any time return, I should be sent for immediately, thus assuring him again that I would give neither time nor thought to any other subject until I'd thoroughly investigated his case. I took my leave. But before getting into the carriage, I told the servant that his master was far from well, and that he should make a point of frequently looking into his room. My own arrangement I made with a view to being quite secure from interruption. I merely called at my lodgings to pick up a travelling desk and a carpet bag, and then I set off in a hackney carriage for an inn about 2 miles out of town, a place called the Horns. It's a very quiet and comfortable house with good thick walls. And there I resolved, without the possibility of intrusion or distraction, to devote some hours of the night to Mr. Jennings' case and so much of the morning as it might require. I returned to my rooms in town at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and immediately found a letter in Mr. Jennings' hand upon the table. His servant, I was told, had bought it the night before, and on learning that I was not to return until today, had seemed very uncomfortable. I opened the letter and read it. Dr. Hesselius, it is here. You had not been an hour gone when it returned. It is speaking. It knows all that has happened. It knows everything. It knows about you, and it is frantic and atrocious. It reviles. I send you this. It knows every word that I have written. This I promised, and therefore I write, but I fear very incoherently. Very much interrupted and disturbed. Ever yours, sincerely yours, Robert Linda Jennings. Well, within a few minutes, I was driving towards Richmond. Now, I by no means despaired of Mr. Jennings' case. In fact, far from being worried, I was profoundly interested and anxious to see and examine him while the enemy was actually present. I drove up to the house, ran up the steps and knocked. The door in a little time was opened by a tall woman in black silk who looked as if she'd been crying. She curtsied and heard my question, but did not answer. Then she turned her face away, extending her hand towards two men who were coming downstairs. And thus, having, as it were, tacitly made me over to them, she passed through a side door hastily and shut it. The man who was nearest the hall I recognized at once as the servant that I had spoken to before, and I was shocked to see that his hands were covered in blood. I drew back a little. What is it, Jones? What's happened? He asked me to come up to the lobby where, frowning and pallid, he told me the horror which I had already half guessed. His master had made away with himself. I went upstairs with him to the room, and well, I'm not going to describe what I saw. Mr. Jennings had cut his throat with a razor. The two men had laid him on the bed and composed his limbs, but it had happened, as the immense pool of blood on the floor declared, at some distance between the bed and the window. And in this sombre, terrible room, one of the great elms that darkened the house was slowly moving the shadow of its great boughs upon this dreadful floor. I beckoned to the servant, and we went downstairs together, and there heard all that he had to tell, which was not much. Mr. Jennings was a gentle, kind master, clearly, and I could see that the servant was much moved. And so, dejected and agitated, I passed from that terrible house and its dark canopy of elms, and I hope that I shall see it no more. Now, writing to you now, my dear Van Loo, I still feel like a man who is but half waked from a frightful dream. My memory rejects the picture with incredulity and horror, and yet I know that it is true. It is the story of the process of a poison which excites the reciprocal action of spirit and nerve and paralyzes the tissues that separates those cognate functions of the senses, the external and the interior. And thus we find strange bedfellows, and the mortal and the immortal prematurely make acquaintance. My friend, you have yourself suffered from an affection similar to that which I have just described. You twice complained of a return of it, and who under God helped you? Your humble servant, Martin Hesselius. Or rather, let me adopt the more emphasized piety of a certain good old French surgeon of 300 years ago. I treated you, and God cured you. Let me tell you a fact. I have met with and treated, as my books show, 57 cases of this kind of vision, which I term interior. Now, there is another class of affections which are less simply curable than a cold in the head or a trifling dyspepsia. But no, it is those which rank in this first category, the interior, that test our promptitude of thought. 57 such cases I've encountered, neither more nor less. And in how many of these have I failed? In no one single instance. There is no one affliction of mortality more easily and certainly reducible with a little patience and a rational confidence in the physician. With these simple conditions, I look upon the cure as absolutely certain. Now, you are to remember now, please, that I had not even commenced to treat Mr. Jennings' case. I have not any doubt that I should have cured him perfectly in 18 months, possibly 2 years. I mean, you know, I think my tract on the cardinal functions of the brain, where by the evidence of innumerable facts, I prove the high probability of a circulation, arterial and venous mechanism through the nerves. Now, of this system, the brain returns in altered state through another, and the nature of that fluid is spiritual, though not immaterial any more than light or electricity are immaterial. Now, by various abuses, among which the habitual use of such agents as green tea is one, this fluid may be affected as to its quality, but it is more frequently disturbed as to equilibrium. This fluid being that which we have in common with spirits, a congestion found on the masses of the brain or nerve connected with the interior sense forms a surface unduly exposed on which disembodied spirits may operate. Communication is thus more or less effectually established. Now, between this brain circulation and the heart circulation, there is an intimate sympathy. The seat, or rather the instrument of exterior vision, is the eye. The seat of interior vision is the nervous tissue and brain immediately about and above the eyebrow. I mean, you will remember yourself how effectively I dissipated your own pictures by the simple application of iced eau de cologne. Well, few cases can, of course, be treated exactly alike, but cold does act powerfully as a repellent of the nervous fluid. Long enough continued, it will produce that permanent insensibility which we call numbness, and a little longer muscular as well as sensational paralysis. I mean, I have not, I repeat, the slightest doubt that given the opportunity, I should have first dimmed and ultimately sealed that inner eye which Mr. Jennings had inadvertently opened. I've never yet failed. Poor Mr. Jennings died by suicide. But that catastrophe was the result of a totally different malady, which, as it were, projected itself upon the disease, which had already been established. His case was, in the distinctive manner, a complication, and the complaint under which he really succumbed was hereditary suicidal mania. But no, but poor Mr. Jennings, I simply cannot call him a patient of mine, for I had not even begun to treat his case. And he had not given me, I'm convinced yet, his full and unreserved confidence. Now, if the patient do not array himself on the side of the disease, his cure is certain. Yes, his cure is certain.